We started on this topic in my last video, and today we're here to finish it off. Basically, we're going through all 30 NBA teams and we're picking out the most overrated player from each squad. Now, it does need to be said that just because a player is overrated doesn't mean they can't also be incredibly talented and productive players, but it simply means that their reputation exceeds the reality of what they are as players in the eyes of the general public. Last video, we went through the teams in the Eastern Conference, so today we'll be finishing up by going through all of the teams in the Western Conference. Before we start though, it turns out a good amount of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but it also very much appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's begin. Going in alphabetical order, we'll be starting with the Dallas Mavericks, and their most overrated player at the moment is Tim Hardaway Jr. It was hard to make a pick for the Mavericks because most guys on their team are honestly a bit underrated, but THJ is a player who seems to only find himself as a topic of discussion during one of his occasional scorching hot shooting nights, and is one of the leaders in the Sixth Man of the Year race because of it. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to be there because he definitely does, but the reality of THJ is that he's incredibly streaky and has just as many nights where his poor shot selection results in some really bad nights. Next up is the Denver Nuggets, and their most overrated player right now is Michael Porter Jr. Again, the Nuggets are another team that doesn't really have anyone that could be perceived as that overrated, but MPJ becomes the selection because he's pretty one-dimensional as a player. He's a comfortable player, letting it fly from anywhere on the court, and trust me, he will do just that. But he's also not necessarily an elite scorer, putting up a modest 16 points per game, and he's not necessarily someone impacting the other areas of the game either. Up next is the Golden State Warriors, and their most overrated player is Klay Thompson. For most of the year, the Warriors have continually given Klay the ultimate green light that he's had for most of his career, because for most of his career, he was one of the best shooters of the basketball the game has ever seen. That, however, is no longer the case. Not only is Klay getting to the point where he's no longer shooting the ball nearly as well as he used to, but the other parts of his game that he also used to be great at, such as perimeter defense, have also started to fade. So now he is a shell of his former self. Next up is the Houston Rockets, and their most overrated player right now is Jalen Green. Green is now 3 years into his career after being drafted 2nd overall in 2021, under the guise that he could blossom into an elite go-to scoring talent. After putting up about 22 points per game last season, he convinced many that he could be the next great young shooting guard on the rise through the ranks, but this year has been pretty eye-opening for the reality of Jalen Green, and unfortunately it hasn't been for the better. The Rockets have started to make competitive moves to get themselves on the right track, but Green has really struggled to acclimate to that, and the fact that he's shooting worse than he ever has at any point in his career this season when real pressure has begun to apply itself is not a great look at his ceiling. Up next is the Los Angeles Clippers, and their most overrated player is Terrence Mann. This summer, we saw Mann get treated like an untouchable star in the making in trade discussions during the peak of the James Harden saga, and it still blows my mind because he's already 27 years old and is a good role player at best. He's putting up about 8 points per game, and he plays good defense, but he's a subpar 3-point shooter, and the Clippers have performed better with him on the bench this season, so for the team to absolutely refuse to even consider putting him in an offer for a superstar is crazy in hindsight. Up next is the Los Angeles Lakers, and their most overrated player right now is Austin Reeves. The Reeves hype train hit peak levels at the end of last season when he emerged in the playoffs as a reliable creator, and this summer he was picked to play for Team USA in the World Cup squad that notably disappointed everyone. Coming into this season, people were talking about Reeves as a potential all-star in the making, and yet here we are 2/3 of the way through the season, and he has struggled a bit to handle the duties of a go-to guy consistently, as his scoring efficiency is down, his scoring is only marginally up overall, and his averages of 15 points and 5 assists per game don't warrant the type of hype that he came in with. Next is the Memphis Grizzlies, and their most overrated player right now is Jaren Jackson Jr. Jaren is the reigning Defensive Player of the Year, but this season when the Grizzlies needed him to step up on both sides of the ball, he showed that he couldn't hold things together in Ja Morant's absence. Jaren is shooting just 44% from the field, which is really poor for a center. He's a subpar three-point shooter despite being a big man that likes shooting from deep, and with his offensive role increasing this season, his defensive impact has definitely taken a bit of a nosedive as well, simultaneously still having issues, committing too many fouls on a regular basis. Up next is the Minnesota Timberwolves, and their most overrated player right now is Karl Anthony Towns. Again, the Wolves are a group that don't really have someone who clearly stands out as overrated by the public, and while Rudy Gobert might be the one that comes to mind for some of you, it's really hard to discredit the fact that his presence is the biggest reason why they're the league's top-ranked defense. Towns has been in the, quote, best big man conversations for years now, yet has had to slide into the role of third most important player on his own team in order for them to finally find some success. Next is the New Orleans Pelicans, and their most overrated player right now is Zion Williamson. Credit where credit is due, Zion has for the most part been healthy and able to stay on the court this year, but it's also been arguably his worst season of his career. He's scoring less frequently than ever, he's grabbing fewer rebounds than ever, and the Pelicans actually perform 6.9 points better without him on the court. So with a combination of his effort not always being there every game, and his lack of aggression compared to prior seasons, the hype he's been surrounded by has definitely surpassed him. Next up is the Oklahoma City Thunder, and their most overrated player right now is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. This is basically only the case because the Thunder's roster is almost entirely made up of underrated players. Shai is in the MVP conversation this year, as he rightfully should be, but I hear way too many people describe him as quote-unquote carrying a mediocre Thunder roster to their success, which could not be further from the truth, as the Thunder have an incredibly deep rotation filled with budding young talent at every position. Up next is the Phoenix Suns, and their most overrated player right now is Bradley Beal. Beal was a big acquisition for the team in the summer to form a star-studded Big Three, but Beal at this point in his career is both carrying one of the worst contracts in the entire league and is just no longer an all-star caliber player. He puts up a modest 18 points per game on slightly above average shooting splits, which is fine, but it's not $50 million per year fine. Next up is the Portland Trail Blazers, and their most overrated player right now is DeAndre Ayton. Ayton was brought in as part of the Damian Lillard trade, and his fit on paper and his potential to be a great NBA big man is ultimately one of the biggest reasons why the Blazers accepted the trade that they did. But Ayton has somehow managed to look even less motivated on the court this season than ever before, and despite being on a team with less pressure, his production across the board is lower than it's ever been. Up next is the Sacramento Kings, and their most overrated player is Malik Monk. Monk dominates discussions about this year's Sixth Man of the Year award, but people love to pretend his production is head and shoulders above the rest of his competition for the award, when it just isn't. He's putting up 15 points per game on league average shooting splits, and is still very streaky game to game, so you never really know what you're going to get from him each night. Next is the San Antonio Spurs, and their most overrated player is Keldon Johnson. Johnson is viewed as a promising rising young talent, but he's now in his 5th season and his play is actually trending in the wrong direction. He averaged an inefficient 22 points per game last year, but now with Victor Wembanyama on the team, his shooting woes are much more prevalent when he's not the number one option, and he's been moved to the bench for the last few months because of it. And finally, the last team in the West is the Utah Jazz, and their most overrated player right now is John Collins. Collins had wanted out of Atlanta for a while in order to seek a bigger role elsewhere, so when he got to Utah, many expected him to return to the days where he was putting up 20 and 10 on a regular basis, but that has just not been the case. He's an athletic forward with a subpar jumper that can put up solid numbers, but the days of hoping that he could be a star in the making are likely long gone. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below who you think are the most overrated players. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.